Hello, today I want to try to answer this question of does the Lord delight in fasting? We know that it's something that takes place in the Bible, and so we'll take a look at what the Lord delights in regards to fasting and what he does not delight in. So the last time we discussed this, we looked at this verse in Proverbs 15:8 that says, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight." And so again, we see right away that this points to not so much the actions of someone as the heart. And we examine that in the life of Saul and David specifically. And so today we'll look at Isaiah chapter 58, which the Lord directly addresses the Israelites about their fasting and explains to them what he desires and does not desire, and what delights him and what does not delight him. So it's a relatively short chapter, but we'll start in verse 1 that says, "Cry loudly, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet, and declare to my people their wrongdoing, and to the house of Jacob their sins." So again, Isaiah is here to proclaim to the Israelites and to the house of Jacob what the Lord was not delighting in. It continues, "Yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways. As a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God. They ask me for just decisions. They delight in the nearness of God." So again, as you read the second verse, you might think they're doing something right here. This seems good, but yet, sadly, the Lord here was being sarcastic in this second verse. It was actually a description of the opposite of what they were doing and what he truly desired for them to do. So again, we have some really interesting points here. The Lord, once in a while, will use this sarcastic language to really express disappointment in his people. And so in verse 2 it says, "They seek me day by day." Again, this constant, continual journey and walking with God and seeking his face, "and delight to know my ways." And so again, what are the Lord's ways? We know that, again, he loves mercy, justice, righteousness, things of this nature. And to know God through his word is to know him and his ways specifically. As a nation that has done righteousness and not forsaken the ordinances of their God. So again, we know that before Moses died and he addressed the Israelites before they walked into the promised land and claimed it, he told them, do not forget the ordinances, the laws, the commandments that God has given you. But yet we know that they were forsaken. They ask me for just decisions. Again, seeking God's will is so important in our lives, not just to go about things on our own wisdom or understanding, but always to be seeking his counsel is so important. Because if we strike out on our own, we'll quickly fail and see the reason for that we have limited judgment, limited knowledge, limited information about when we make decisions. They delight in the nearness of God. So again, twice this is mentioned, this delight that the people were to have to know his ways and also in the nearness of God. And that's the greatest blessing that we can have. When we seek to know him, when we strive to know his righteousness, to know everything about him, to be in his word and have his word dwelling within our hearts, and to seek his counsel and to be praying regularly, then we can experience this great joy of the nearness of God in our lives and delight in that above everything else and receive our greatest joy from that. So again, sadly, this was the blueprint that the Lord had given the people, that they might live and experience blessings, abundant blessings from his presence individually and as a nation. Yet they'd turned their back on this over time more and more. And so after this, he addresses the issue of fasting. Specifically in verse 3, he says, "Why have we fasted and you do not see?" So he's speaking for the people here because they would fast and yet they expected him to act based on their fasting. "Why have we humbled ourselves? You do not notice. Behold, on the day of your fast, you find your desire and oppress all your workers." So again, here the people were fasting but yet their hearts were still far from the Lord and far from what he delighted in. They were oppressing those around them. Behold, you fast for contention and strife, and to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast, like ye have done today, to make your voice heard on high. So there's two different types of fasting, depending on where the heart is. Is it a fast like this that I choose, a day for a person to humble himself? Is it for bowing one's head like a reed and for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord? So again, we think of fasting as being a point of humility, of humbling oneself, and there's definitely a part in that. But yet, ultimately, this was not the plan of the Lord. The Lord never planned for periods of fasting. It was the opposite, that he wanted them to celebrate festivals and feasts and days of observances and days of remembrance. He never called for a season of fasting. Fasting was something that happened when something bad were to take place, or the people recognized their sin and repentance, would come to the Lord in fasting and humble themselves before him with a right heart. He continues in verse 6, is this not the fast that I choose? So again, it wasn't that he wanted the people always to be humbling themselves before them, keeping good things from them that he wanted to bless them with. That wasn't the plan for his people. It was the opposite. It was abundance. It was delight in the Lord primarily, but also in the blessings that he gave them through food and drink and fellowship that they had. So he says, is this not the fast that I choose? To release the bonds of the wickedness, to undo the ropes of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke. Righteousness and justice were the fast that he chose. This is what he delighted in. This was the way of the Lord and wanted it to be the way of the people as well. Is it not to break your bread with the hungry? Again, mercy, grace, this generous nature, and to bring the homeless poor into the house. When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourselves from your own flesh. So this is what the Lord desired again, above this idea of fasting, which had taken on a religious nature. It was an outward appearance or an outward act without the heart that was pleasing to God, without the greater substance of the life, delighting in the ways of the Lord. They were oppressing the poor, they were overlooking the needy, and instead they had this empty, hollowed out form of religion that the Lord took no delight in and was not a benefit or practical in any way. In verse 8 it continues, if they were to follow these things, he says, then your light will break out like the dawn, and your recovery will spring up quickly, and your righteousness will go before you. The glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness. So again, we have this great blessing, what the Lord desires, for his presence to be near, for our prayers to be heard. And it wasn't the fasting that brought about the hearing of the prayer, but the heart and the delight in the way of the Lord again. And if you offer yourself to the hungry and satisfy the need of the afflicted, then your light will rise in darkness, and your gloom will become like midday. And the Lord will continually guide you. So again, here we have that seeking after the will of the Lord through prayer, through relying on him, and through the acknowledgement of his wisdom over our own. And satisfy your desire in scorched places, and give strength to your bones. And you will be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters do not fail. So again, here we have the abundance of the Lord. Ultimately, he doesn't want us to deprive ourselves for the sake of taking good things that he wishes to bless us with away from ourselves. That's not the fasting he delights in. He delights in, again, seeking him, knowing him, following his ways, giving to the poor, blessing those around us. That's what he delights in. There were times for fasting that we'll talk about tomorrow, but this wasn't the fasting that was pleasing to him, again, that the Israelites were following. Those from among you who rebuild the ancient ruins, You will raise up the age-old foundations, and you will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets in which to dwell. So again, we have this idea of restoration, of building up what the Lord originally intended for his people. It's kind of a reference to the rebuilding of Jerusalem eventually, the walls, the temple, the city itself. But reformations are very important for our own personal faith and for us as a people to seek the original intent of God's will in our lives, the original intent of his commandments, his word, his saving us, his calling us forward. Again, it's to delight in him, like we read early on in this chapter. And so I'll just read that again here just as a refreshment. Yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways. Again, to know what's true of God. And we know that from his word. We learn that from his word daily. As a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God. Again, he desires obedience over sacrifice. They ask me for just decisions. Again, seeking the Lord's counsel, praying, relying on him, and again, observing and acknowledging his will, his strength, his ultimate wisdom. They delight in the nearness of God. This is what ultimately the Lord delights in, is that when we delight in him, because we know again from Psalm 37:4, when we delight in the Lord, he'll give us the desires of our heart, again, which is an abundant goodness and joy in our lives. So I'll finish just by reading the last two verses of this chapter. If because of the Sabbath you restrain your foot from doing as you wish on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a pleasure, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways and seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word. Again, focus a little bit less here on the Sabbath and more on these ideas here. The Sabbath was commanded by the Lord then, obviously is an important day, but remember the point of the Sabbath, which is similar to what we just spoke of, the point of a day of fasting. A day of pleasure because of the nearness of the Lord, that we take away the things of the world around us and delight in him above everything else. And honor it, desisting from your own ways, your own pleasure, and your own word. Again, acknowledging the Lord's ways, the pleasure of drawing near to him, and the joy of knowing him and his comfort, and speaking his word rather than our own, and taking times really to delight and focus upon that. Every day for us can be that Sabbath. And he finishes lastly in the chapter, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. So again, interestingly, lastly in this chapter is the mention of this feeding, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So the feeding was contrary to this fasting, that they were seeking to make up for their own sin and unrighteousness by this outward, hollow appearance of fasting. But it was just that. There was no heart in it. And they were depriving themselves of food, yet also depriving themselves of their delight in God, which is our greatest gift, the Lord himself. So it's a great blessing, again, to know that we can have these things. And as we move forward, we'll examine true fasting, where that comes from. But otherwise, until then, we can continue to delight in knowing him and the nearness of him. Take care.